Dr. Wimlav, here to answer why is it important to understand power and structural violence when trying to resolve conflicts? Uh, we want to think about conflict within a system, but we want to think about the different parts that can impact context that are sometimes well understood and sometimes completely like a fish in the ocean. They don't know the water that they're in the middle of. The part of the reason I'm starting from that context is that there are some truths to power, and one of them is the person who has it doesn't always realize it, and the person without it always knows it, right? So you take the fish out of the water, it knows like it's suffocating, right? Um, but when it's swimming around, that's just the normal, right? It's not recognized. So when you feel like you're in that power disadvantage, it changes your behavior. Um, but the person with the power, right? They might just be, being themselves and not really realize that there's some leveraging that's taking place, or perhaps some fear, right? If you go to talk to your boss and your hope is to talk about how great a job you've been doing, right? You have this unmet need that you feel like your contributions to the workplace aren't being fully appreciated. Maybe you feel like you deserve a raise, or you're curious when you might get one, if there are raises anywhere on the horizon, um, right? And you try to bridge that pathway, because that's really kind of what you'd like to talk about. You don't want to come right out and say it, right? Why might a person not want to come right out and say to a boss, I don't feel like I'm being paid enough, right? Fear, right? Fear is a powerful motivator for non-action, right? You don't want to get on your boss's bad side. They can control how many hours you work, how much you get paid, or even if you have a job at all, right? There's lots of things that can go into why you might not feel comfortable. Now that boss may be, a bad boss. By all stretches of the imagination, I've worked with people, or I've worked for people who were really not very nice. They weren't about taking care of their employees. They didn't, live up to OSHA regulations and so forth. And people would have, things that you would say legitimately, like they should be able to complain. They are not having the safety equipment that they need and so forth. But just because you're in the right doesn't mean that you feel comfortable, right? So that's what power is. Power is the ability to get others to do what you want. And in some of those cases, it means the ability to get people to work without the appropriate safety equipment because maybe they don't feel like paying for it. In other cases, however, bosses are just regular people who make mistakes. They're fallible, but frequently they want to take care of their employees. Right? The cost of training somebody as a replacement is prohibitive and stuff in some cases. But actually, they might really be good people, right? They have no reason to not want to do well for their employees, and they want to have an open door policy and so forth. But, right? But there are historical features or contextual issues that might cause people to feel like even if the person says you can tell me anything, that they wouldn't do it. So power is a contextual feature which can impact the willingness of people to engage in conflict, right? If you're afraid that the other person has power over you, right, questioning them might not be as likely. There might be risk, there might be fear. Now, when people have power and they are using it, right, then that can be even more exaggerated. And we know that there's coercive use of power in all sorts of locations and places. And it's horrible, right? The abuses that we see and hear and read about in the news, or that maybe it's happened to you or people that you know, right? I mean, like this is really horrible stuff, and it does happen, and it's very disappointing. Um, but yeah, so power can be corrupted. Power can be used, for people to in order to get what they want. Um, and structural violence, right, can also operate in some of these same ways. Our structures, our systems can incentivize certain behaviors. They can disincentivize certain behaviors. And some of the things that they're motivating might actually increase violence against specific individuals or specific populations. Right? We can combine the two in some cases even, right? Power. Who are people with power? People like police officers, right? They can flash lights and pull you over. And I think that authority gets used appropriately, the overwhelming, number of cases. I don't want to guess on percentages. I mean, I just would think that like the number of unlawful stops, you know, would be pretty small. But we know of specific departments that would have racist profiling that was taking place, ulterior motives. We know of specific officers, right? Like famous case in Texas, police officer admitted that he targeted African American women in his sexual assaults because he knew that they'd be less likely to be believed. Right? This is an individual wielding his power in a way that's abusive, but it's also structural violence. Right? We have a system in place. Call it what you will, right? There's a lot of things that are involved in how we end up in a position where black women in America are less likely to be believed than white women in America. It's factual, right? We have the evidence to support that claim. We also know that the officer said that's why he chose to do that. That's structural violence. Systems that don't believe people, right? Disproportionately biased and prejudiced, right? That's structural violence. So, if we want to understand how to resolve conflicts, frequently we're going to have to understand the operation of both, right? Not all conflicts will have both power and structural violence, but it will impact the ability of sides to negotiate with each other, right? Neutral third parties, if they get involved in conflicts, need to be able to see through some of this and identify whether or not one side is being taken advantage of in the dispute. Does that mean that the so-called neutral third party is supposed to take sides? No, but the agent reality part of the conflict work means asking, go to caucus, find out from both of your sides. Do you feel like that this is going to be a fair agreement? Are all of your needs being met? Are you going to be able to live up to the terms? Do you think that this is what the judge would rule if you took it to court? Do you think, right? What's going on, right? Parties need to be able to advocate for themselves. A mediator who doesn't believe that a party is able to work on their own behalf actually needs to, in most jurisdictions, withdraw from that, say that case isn't eligible for mediation. But you need to be able to trust parties to be able to make decisions for themselves. So as a mediator, I never decided for a party that they need to do better than that, or I thought they were being taken advantage of. That really was up to what their specific needs were. And part of what I learned is that sometimes parties aren't worried so much about the $20 or $100 or whatever extra in a settlement. They're actually more worried about a payment plan being manageable, because if you have a debt that you can't manage the payment on, that can really throw everything off. Stuff like that. So, again, people who are disempowered may be more likely to engage into a negotiation to reach an agreement that disadvantages them. But people who are disempowered also might miss opportunities, right? They might feel like that they've been victimized so much in the past that they don't trust. They don't trust that an outcome is good for them, when in fact sometimes that might actually be the best option or opportunity that they have. And their lack of trust because of the disempowerment may cause them to make, poor decisions. Again, trust is really important, and trust can be related to our experiences with power. Trust can also be related to our experiences with structural violence. If you're guilty of a crime, whether or not the institution is racist may or may not be irrelevant, right? Why do I say that? Well, if you're guilty, that doesn't necessarily mean that you want to take a plea agreement that's being offered by somebody who's actually wants to sentence you to more than you're likely to get if you lose a trial. What's the deal there, right? Lots of different stories like that. Anyway, so we're talking about a contextual apparatus in which the past history and experience of a party or the parties may present different features of their operation and connection to power and their feelings about how they want to be influenced or respond to having power or having it taken away. Again, same with structural violence. Some people will spend lots of time, trying to fight against systems because they're oppressive, and I think that's commendable. However, it's really hard for single individuals to take on large institutions. And so there's parts to this where different experience and different exposure might give us the means for engaging in better strategy. And this is the real part that I want to focus on with this question. Why is it important to understand those when trying to resolve conflicts? If our motivation is to bring some resolution between individuals or groups in disputes, our task is not taking on the structures of violence or rectifying the conditions of power. It's just being able to grasp and become aware of the influence on the context that those instruments have, right? And so that once we identify the part that we can manage, we can work on that, right? We may not be able to do anything to mitigate the power differential. Some power differentials are deserved, right? It's like a parent and a child. If I'm going to try and help out like a parent-child dispute, let's imagine it's, a teenager. The parent has a lot of power. Teenage child might have some very specific needs. Well, we don't necessarily have to talk about why the parent has power over the juvenile if what we're really having is a conflict over privacy. Parent has issues of trust with a teenage child, maybe over suspected drug use. Teenage child is like, I don't think that it's fair that you're going through my stuff. How does that get managed, right? Maybe that there is a way to come to an agreement about not having somebody search through the room. Maybe it requires something else that's more comfortable. I mean, I don't know. I remember the time that my father drug tested me as a teenager. So it was an interesting experience in my life. I actually kind of had it figured out, like why he was asking for me to collect a urine sample, but I didn't do drugs, so it really didn't bother me. And then he asked me later on, he was like, you didn't ask me anything about it. And I was like, well, I knew what it was for. I just didn't know why you were asking for it. Interesting part of the situation of growing up in the 90s and having a father who was a doctor. He was able to get stuff tested. He just took it to work, literally. But the part of the story that was really remarkable to me was he said when he picked me up, I had a lot of energy. And then like 30, 45 minutes later, I was really tired. So he thought I must have been under the influence of marijuana or something. And I was like, you picked me up from cross country practice. I had energy because I just ran 8 miles. And then I got tired because I had just run 8 miles, you know? Um, but yeah, I would have felt like it was an invasion of my privacy to go through my room, but I didn't care. Like, drug test me. I'd like for you to know that I'm clean. But not everybody would feel that way about a situation like that, right? Knowing the context of the power and the structural violence can help us to get through different issues. He wants to know that I'm clean and sober. Not an illegitimate request from a parent, in my opinion. I mean, kids will be kids, and you know, if you're breaking the rule, that's usually when it becomes more of an issue, right? Because you're being accused of something. People don't like being accused of things when they're not doing it. They especially don't like being accused of it when they are doing it, right? Based on my experience, at least. So anyway, so the power is ultimately I wasn't going to be able to refuse all requests. I mean, I suppose like kids probably do like sue their parents to say you're not allowed to get me drug tested, or you have to have probable cause or something. But I mean, like, and I don't mean to make a joke out of it, but like the Bill of Rights applies to what the government's allowed to do to its citizens, not what the citizens are or the juvenile citizens are allowed to protect themselves from in terms of their parents, right? A right to privacy does not mean that a child can't have their room searched by a parent. It just means that the government can't come in and look through the room without permission or a warrant. Again, power, structural violence influence the dynamics. It influences behaviors. That's a big part of what we're looking at here. And when we have an awareness of those features, we might not be able to counteract them. That might not be our job. But being aware of what's going on there can help us to both strategize if we're in the conflict or if we're trying to help other parties in dispute. And it can also just help us in general make better predictions. When you have a dispute where there's really significant power imbalance, if you're not able to get people talking to each other this way, I mean, it really might not be a case for mediation. If this person who has a lot of power knows that they have a lot of power and they're going to talk down to this person, no reason to egg that person on. Have that person find him or herself feeling, more abused. Anyway, it's important to understand it because it helps us to define parameters about what reasonable expectations are and helps us to strategize. If there's a big power differential, we want to be able to mitigate some of the differential, at least for the terms of having a rule enforcement for a process. A boss and an employee might not be the same when they leave the mediation room, but we're going to make sure that we enforce the ground rules that we agree upon while we're engaging in the dispute. That means that I know normally you're allowed to interrupt the employee, but while we're talking about this and processing this, it's really important for me to be able to ask the questions and then come back to you. And if we could all agree, right, as long as you get the buy-in, everybody agrees that we won't interrupt each other, then I think we're in a good place. So hopefully this is helpful to get the juices going on thinking about how some of this engages in our conflicts and our experience with conflict resolution. See you all in the next one.